Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest general election voting intention polls from YouGov out today, because there are multiple points of interest. First of all, it shows the Tories on a record low. Second, because the contrast with how the polls changed before last year's local elections is remarkable, I want to discuss that as well. But first, in isolation, let's look at these poll results. The Conservatives on 18%. Absolute record low. I think actually for any pollster, but certainly for YouGov. Lower even than during Liz Truss's lettuce was. But the context makes it even more remarkable. It was just under 2 weeks ago, Rishi Sunak engaged in what was being described as a policy blitz. He was going to do a week of major policy announcements, really get people fired up. He was going to turn things around, and the local elections weren't going to be as bad as people supposed. He carried out a series of speeches on, it covered things like welfare, defence, asylum, particular focus on the Rwanda plan, all designed to appeal to what the Tory think are their core voters. Now, the focus was on the local elections, of course. It was about getting people to turn out for the local and mayoral elections. And of course, this voting intention poll is a general election voting intention poll. It's got nothing to do with the local elections in theory. However, the policy announcements were intended to target typical Conservative voters. And because they were reported to a national audience, it will have impacted people's general election voting intentions as well. This was Rishi Sunak stepping up a gear and really going hard on campaigning in what will have been a dry run for the general election itself. In return, Labour have had a couple of counters. They staged a big speech about their rail nationalisation plans, and they have been relentlessly pushing the Tories to explain how they intend to pay for the £46 billion a year it will cost to scrap national insurance. But I think it's fair to say the Tories have grabbed more headlines than Labour. And those headlines have been in terms of what I have been describing as performative cruelty. Attacks on people in receipt of both out of work and in work benefits. People with disabilities, people with mental health illnesses in particular have been attacked by the Tories. There's been the focus on the Rwanda plan. Essentially Tory culture wars, right? But the end result has been that Labour's vote share is basically where it's been for a very long time now, and the Tories have fallen to a new low. This poll has come hot on the heels of Sunak actually trying his best to make it sound like his government has plans. The best he can do has resulted in record low polling. It will be interesting to see what other pollsters think over the next few days, but YouGov is worth paying special attention to because they've proven themselves to be one of the very best at this sort of polling. Now, although I didn't know that this poll was going to be a record low for the Tories, I was waiting for it to come out because, and I talked about this a few weeks ago, I wanted to compare the direction of travel with last year. See, in the run-up to local elections, you always get a heightened level of campaigning, which will inevitably be reported in the national news and so therefore influence general election voting intention. From the end of March to the local election date, politicians are out and about trying to grab the headlines. Anyone thinking that the polls will narrow in the Tories' favour during the general election campaign will have taken heart from the local elections last year to an extent. You know, I compared for this year and last year, the YouGov polling at the end of March and just before the local election. So last year, the Tories didn't move up or down. They, 5 weeks before the local elections, they were on 26% nationally. And the poll just before the local elections, 26% still. 26% now seems like a luxury, doesn't it? They really should have had that election last year. However, Labour last year dipped from 46% to 43%. That meant that the poll gap narrowed by 3 points. Now, people will have looked at this and observed that during an election campaign, the poll gap narrowed, and so they'll imagine the same thing would happen in the general election. But let's have a look at what's happened this year. First of all, worth pointing out that Conservative campaigning is not only on a more professional footing, but the day-to-day campaign activities have been led by the man who is going to lead the Conservatives' general election campaign, Isaac Levidow. There's no more Greg Hands going out and about with his joke note like last year. Now we have the same professionals running these local election campaigns as are going to run the general election campaign. So surely the result would be even better for the Tories this year, more professional footing, especially as Sunak has probably been better used. Now, last year, if you look up like Rishi Sunak local election campaign, what you'll find is a load of photos of him staring at a pothole. Wasn't really very effective. He's not very good at going out and about, you see. Now, this year what they didn't bother with all that staring at potholes. They decided, just carry out a load of major policy speeches. Now, being honest, I think that is a better use of his talents. He's not good at campaigning on the street. He hasn't got people skills. But he can read. So getting him to deliver speeches to a selected audience, that's way better. So the results should reflect this, yes? Well, the last poll this March had the Tories on 21%. And this final one before polling day has them on 18%. So last year they stayed the same during the roughly 5-week period. This year they've dropped 3 points. And that's not the extent of the bad news. Across the same polls, Labour have gone from 40% to 44%. Now, just to be clear, that 40% 5 weeks ago did represent an uncharacteristic dip at the end of March. It's not like Labour vote share has sort of been at round about 40% and has now just suddenly jumped up. 44% is round about where it has been on average. So it's really just a correction. But nonetheless, in the 5 weeks leading up to the local elections, when both parties were campaigning hard, spending a lot of money and demanding attention from the media, the Tories lost 3 points and Labour gained 4. The net result is that the poll gap narrowed by 3 points last year, but has widened by 7 points this year. Now, as is always the case, people are going to try to read the runes of the local election results and gauge what might happen in a general election. It's always a fairly futile exercise because there's only so many voters can vote in local elections in any given year, because we have local elections every year, different parts of the country, whereas the general election is for everyone all at once. It's also about different issues, even though a lot of people do use their vote in local elections as a proxy vote of confidence or upset at the Westminster government. But with polling like this, really doesn't matter what the local elections look like. This is a Conservative Party who have massively stepped up campaigning and campaign spending since January the 1st. Isaac Levidow, the person who is going to run their general election campaign, has been in charge full-time of all Conservative campaigning since the start of the year. Sunak has just gone out and campaigned his heart out, and the result is going backwards for the Tories. I wish it would make the Tories think that maybe culture wars and fake spending promises aren't going to work for them. I suspect it won't, so they will carry on doing the wrong things in the wrong ways and being surprised how badly the polls are going for them, or, come up with excuses like they did in 1997. But what we can see is that during an election campaign in which the Tories are trying very hard, the polls will not necessarily narrow. They actually widened this year. There's no reason to suppose the polls will narrow at all during the general election. Now, the Tories do still hold a couple of aces. Voting intention, for example, does not take account of people turned away from the polling station because of voter suppression. Like there's a military veteran who's posted today, his government-issued veteran card was not accepted as valid ID, for example. Now, if someone had have checked carefully, they might have realised this, but, a lot of people will think to themselves, oh, you need photo ID. Well, this is government-issued photo ID, so there's fine. It's like, no, it's not. Some people will not know at all. Maybe he didn't know he needed it, but that's what he carries around with him. And so try to produce it, then no, that's not valid. The second ace they hold is a Cambridge Analytica scale misinformation operation once the general election campaign begins for real. Now, remember, the targeting of political messages by Cambridge Analytica was illegal. It was illegal when they did it in the UK. It was illegal when they did it in the US. It's illegal, right? But the Conservatives have been passing legislation to allow this sort of practice to be lawful during an election campaign. And they've been harvesting personal information in order to power it. we're going to see an appalling but highly sophisticated disinformation operation when the election kicks off. The combination of these two things, the voter ID, which disproportionately hits people who are not going to vote Conservative, and the Cambridge Analytica style targeted media email messaging, that could indeed help the Tories. And it could actually cause the polls to narrow, which is why we have to be wary of being too complacent. But beyond these two dirty tricks, neither of which can be accounted for in the voting intention polls right now, all of the Conservatives' normal campaigning activities are actually doing them no good at all. That Sunak has gone on a major policy bender and the polling has actually gotten worse is tragically hilarious. He'd have literally been better, as far as we can tell from the polls, having just stayed in bed those days. I suppose some Tory MPs will look at this and think, it's a good job we didn't hold the general election today, isn't it? But actually, no. You may be failing to take account of the fact that these poll ratings are still moving. Every time they think it's sunk to the lowest possible level, it goes lower still. There was a point where they were polling 20% on YouGov. Oh, well, it can't get any lower than that, can it? Then it went to 19%. Oh, well, at least it can't get lower than that. Today it's 18%. And that's after a big campaign. I'm not sure I would say this is likely, but you can't rule out a poll at some point this summer showing Reform UK on about the same as the Tories. They're only 3 points behind in this poll. And some polling shows that they might finish second to Labour in the Blackpool by-election. Because think about the elections going on today. So we've got local elections. Don't tell you a lot about a general election. You've got mayoral elections. Basically tells you nothing about a general election. You've got PCC elections. They don't tell you anything either. There's London Assembly elections, But there is a Westminster election today. The by-election for Blackpool South caused by Scott Benton being a naughty boy. That is the only one that is in any way instructive about how people would vote in a Westminster election, because it is the only Westminster election taking place today. And the polling suggests that Labour will win it handsomely. And Reform UK will beat the Conservatives into third place. So, yeah. In fact, you just look at how much Reform UK have grown since last year. This brainless Rwanda plan has done the Tories no good at all, but has been feeding Reform. Such idiocy that they continue to push it. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.